Coming in number 10, we have Arne Johnson. Not everything that the Warrens were involved in had to do with them going into a house to try and kick some spiritual butt. I mean, this case started like that, but then it turned into one of the most famous court cases of all time. Arne Johnson had the Warrens come to his home to help a young boy who was apparently possessed by a demon. The Warrens were successful in ripping the demons out of this boy's body, which there were apparently 40 of, but something went wrong. The demons left the boy's body, but then moved over to Arne Johnson's body. Can we just address a couple of things here? First, how many demons can fit into one body? This dude had a house party living inside of him, and that turned him completely evil. But what if you just had like 1 or 2 demons inside of you? Could you just keep living as a normal person, but you would just feel dehydrated sometimes? Like, what's the deal on that? And you think the Warrens would be better at their job and know to not let the demons move from one body into another body. But back to my story of Mr. Johnson. These demons started to drive him crazy, and then one day he snapped and attacked his landlord. He stabbed him multiple times, which led to his death. Johnson was arrested, and during the trial he used the defense of being possessed, where the Warrens actually came in to speak on the matter, since they kinda were the reason that the demons were in his body. Now, even though these demons were floating around in him, apparently he was still sent to prison, which I think is the right thing to do.
Number 9, Highgate Cemetery. Where were they for the vampire hysteria at Highgate Cemetery? Like, where were you? When I learned about this case, I was flabbergasted, and it's weird to me that they weren't there. They've dealt with werewolves, but missed out on vampires completely? The Highgate Cemetery in London, England has some of the oldest graves in the world, making it the perfect breeding ground for ghosts, ghouls, goblins, and vampires. Ooh, it's spooky season. The Highgate vampire case caused a media uproar in the 60s that culminated in 2 magicians facing off to see who could catch the vampire first. It all started when 2 girls reported seeing the dead rise from the graves while walking through Swain Lane one night. Soon, animal carcasses drained of blood started turning up. Newspapers had their cameras ready. A massive vampire hunt was organized on Friday, April 13th, Friday the 13th, in 1973, and bodies were even exhumed from their graves to see if they were toothy. Sadly, no one caught anything, but the case still sends a tingle down the spines of vampire enthusiasts around the world. Legends of the demon, though, continue, along with sightings of a crazed old woman and corpses appearing in places they shouldn't be. Number 8, the Bell Witch. I searched the internet far and wide to see if the Warrens had ever visited the Bell Farm, but alas, no. If I'm wrong and I missed something, post a link down in the comments, because I'm not perfect and maybe I missed it. But as far as I can see, they never actually checked out one of the most famous hauntings in the world. 200 years later, the Bell Cave remains an attraction, and many still report hearing a shrill, scratchy voice when no one is around and see orbs surrounding the farm, or where it used to stand. Though the actual events happened well before the time of the Warrens and the farm was torn down, the Bell Cave was still there. If there was any duo who could have proven the tale of the Bell Witch, it was them, but maybe, just maybe, they were afraid of what they might find. Number 7, Michael Taylor. The Michael Taylor case is one of the strangest I've ever come across while doing lists like this, and it certainly needed Ed and Lorraine. The horrifying events of Michael Taylor happened in the 1970s, specifically 1974. A man who was considered a good husband, father, and community man suddenly flipped. He began enduring bouts of severe depression and was visiting a 21-year-old pastor named Marie Robinson for counsel. His wife was obviously suspicious, but the sessions were helping. Mary allegedly performed many exorcisms on him to expel the demons. Taylor's wife was getting pretty antsy, and they ended up having a confrontation during which Taylor attacked his wife. It was after this moment Taylor resolved to undergo a full-blown exorcism on October 5th, 1974. During this, Michael had seizures, he spit and bit the ministers, and screamed in tongues. Unfortunately though, it did not expel all the demons, and Taylor returned home in a rage. He took the life of his wife in an incredibly gruesome way, and was later found screaming in the street, naked and covered in blood. I don't think the Warrens ever encountered anything as violent, but imagine if they did. Number 6, Richard Gallagher and Julia. Richard Gallagher is a man I find entirely fascinating because his transition from being a man of science to a full-on believer of the occult is, for lack of a better word, insane. Now obviously the Warrens had their domain, but imagine if these guys collaborated on this case? What? Though, I don't know if Gallagher needed the help, just saying. The case I'm referring to is when Gallagher encountered a transformative possession. Gallagher became the go-to guy to diagnose people who claimed to be possessed. An Ivy League psychiatrist, he would help those who were mistaking mental illness for something mystical. Julia was the first time he encountered someone he couldn't explain. Julia was the queen of a satanic cult and had become possessed, which she desperately wanted to be rid of. Skeptical at first, but when Richard sat down to talk to her, she knew intimate details about his life. Objects would fly off the wall, and once during a phone call with the priest, they both heard one of the demonic voices she'd speak in around them, even though Julia was across the country. Number 5, the Thornton Heath poltergeist. It was the 1970s. Thornton Heath, England. Where were the Warrens? Probably busy, or too scared to bother with such a terrifying case. It all started one hot August evening when the family living in the house was awoken by their radio suddenly blaring to life. This was just the beginning to a terrible haunting the family would endure for 4 years. Objects would fall or be thrown across the room by invisible hands, you know, all the usual poltergeisty things. One night, the son awoke to find a man standing at the end of his bed, like staring at him with like venom in his eyes. After a bunch of startling incidents, they tried to have the house blessed, but it failed. However, a medium did discover that the house was haunted by a couple named the Chattertons who considered them trespassers on their property. The family eventually had no other option but to move out, and the activity has since ceased. But imagine if the Warrens were on the case, probably would have been solved so much sooner, or not, who knows. Number 4, the Danny poltergeist case. In 1998, a woman named Jane Fishman reported strange happenings regarding an antique bed in the home of Al Cobb in Savannah, Georgia. It was a vintage 1800s bed that Cobb bought at auction for his son, a purchase he later regretted. 3 nights after it was purchased, Jason, the son, told his parents that someone was watching him on the bed. He felt cold breath on his neck and saw the impressions of elbows dipping into the pillow. He also noticed the photo of his deceased grandparents lying face down on the dresser, which became a reoccurring event. After he put it back up, it'd fall back out. But then, one morning, an assortment of strange objects, including animals made from shells, was found on his bed after he'd already gone down to breakfast. That got his parents and his twin brother's attention. They left paper and crayons out and asked the ghost what his name was. Then later they came back to see Danny 7 written on the paper. After several communications and a smashed terracotta planter, it was clear that Danny didn't want anyone in his bed. The family eventually got rid of the bed, but that didn't solve the problem. Turns out Jason's connection to the spirits went skin deep, and he continued to see things after the event. Number 3, here we go. The Winchester House. This place is on my bucket list to visit, so it's a wonder to me why the Warrens never checked it out. Again, I googled it, they didn't. Prove me wrong in the comments. I welcome correction, as always. Thank you. But it's essentially a 24,000 square feet mansion with 10,000 windows, 2,000 doors, 160 rooms, 52 skylights, 47 stairways and fireplaces, 17 chimneys, 13 bathrooms, 6 kitchens, and cost Sarah $5 million to build, about $71 million today. There are stairs and doors that lead to nowhere, windows that don't open. It's a labyrinth of mystery. Sarah Winchester and her husband William Winchester amassed a huge fortune from their sale of the, you guessed it, Winchester rifle. After her daughter died of TB and William left Sarah a widow, she consulted a medium who told her that she would constantly be haunted by the spirits killed by the Winchester rifle. The house never stopped construction until she died in 1922. It is said the house was built to trap the spirits inside. Today, it's considered one of the most haunted places in the world and is well worth a visit for anyone seeking a scare. So where the heck were the Warrens to debunk this thing? It would have been awesome. Number 2, the Amityville horror case. Obviously, I had to put this case on the list because this case remained the scariest event of Ed and Lorraine's career.
It had the monstrosities of the night which roamed that house, which infested it, which caused a young man to murder his whole family.
The events at Amityville, Long Island in 1975 shook the nation and the box office. The Lutz family moved into their dream suburban home with optimism and hope for their life. But little did they know, a year earlier, Ronald DeFia Jr. shot and killed all 6 members of his family, priming the property with evil. The Lutzes didn't know what to make of the swarms of flies, loud, aggressive banging noises, disturbing entities, and even levitations occurring in the home. So they got the hell out of Dodge, leaving all their belongings in the process. When they finally called the Warrens in, George Lutz, the father, who was, by the way, an ex-Marine and karate expert, literally supposed to be fearless, wouldn't even meet them at the house. They met at a Pizza Hut. But as soon as the Warrens began working on the case, they understood why.
The Amityville case affected our personal lives more than any case we ever worked on.
To this day, Lorraine says that this is the case that haunts her the most, and said that she hoped this was the close to hell as she would ever get. So if that's not too scary, I don't know what is. And now we are getting to number 1, the Warrens. Demons, poltergeists, and ghosts. It was hard to find a case that the Warrens wouldn't face. They seemed fearless, their love strong enough to withstand all the forces of darkness, or at least that's how the movies told it. It turns out that the real case the Warrens were too afraid of was the horrifying truth of their marriage. Yup, we're going there. If you're a fan of the movie franchise, then you know that Lorraine had a lot of influence on the stories up until her death, but a weird detail in her contact alludes to some nefarious activity in their personal life. Neither Ed or Lorraine Warren could be depicted violating anyone or performing adult acts with a minor. The reason that was in there might have something to do with the case of Judith Penny. Penny stayed with the Warrens as a young woman and allegedly had an inappropriate relationship with Ed, and Lorraine knew about it. Judith made a legal declaration in November 2014 stating that Penny and Ed had begun an amorous relationship when he was her bus driver and she moved in with them in 1963. That same year, Penny was arrested when someone noticed the illegal relationship between her and Ed. Why she was arrested and not him remains in question to me, but Penny also stated that Ed was abusive towards Lorraine, saying, and I quote, "Sometimes Ed would actually have to slap her across the face to shut her up. Some nights I thought they were going to kill each other." Lorraine denied the allegations through representatives, and there are still a lot of loose ends, but I suppose whatever happened has already been taken to the grave.
Coming in at number 10, we have the Connecticut poltergeist. I found a video clip of Ed and Lorraine investigating the haunting of a Connecticut home. This haunting was later the basis for the movie The Haunting in Connecticut, because they were being haunted in Connecticut. It makes so much sense. Ed Warren says that this is one of the most compelling pieces of evidence for poltergeist activity caught on camera. The family were being plagued by ghostly activity and wanted help, so they called demonologists. It seems in the footage, Ed is holding a seance to contact a spirit. This is what happens when he asks who's there.
1 knock for yes, 2 for no. Are you a man? Are you a boy?
Then this is what happens when asked if the young spirit wants the family to leave.
You want the people in this house to move? 1 knock for yes, 2 for no. Yes.
The Warrens also recorded this footage of the poltergeist moving chairs.
Give me some sign.
Later, the poltergeist is shown trying to pull a chair out from under a child. Years later, Lorraine was interviewed about the house and she said the spirits were cleared with an exorcism. She also said this.
There was a very old tree that was right in front of this house. There was no wind at all, no wind whatsoever, and the tree broke in half.
Next on the list, guys, we have the Perron family. This is a very disturbing case that is one of the most famous that the Warrens investigated. If you have seen the movie The Conjuring, then you will have an idea of what went on here. This is the case the movie was based on. And to be fair, the real case is actually even scarier. This was when the Perron family moved into a home back in 1971. They were probably happy to have a house that was such a steal, but all that happiness would go away when they found out what was going on within the walls. Turns out the whole place was infested with ghosts ghosts. At first it seemed like nothing too big. There were small items that would go missing and dirt that would show up in rooms. Then things started to get more intense. Their beds would float and people started to see ghosts walk through the halls. The Perron family started to look into what was going on in this home, and they found out that many people had died on the property. A lot of them had taken their own life, and there were even people who had hung themselves, or even creepier, some people had drowned themselves behind the house in a river. The Warrens came through and were able to perform an exorcism to clean up the house, and the Perrons eventually stopped having ghostly troubles. Next on the list, guys, we have the White Lady of Union Cemetery. The Union Cemetery is one of the most famously haunted places in America. This has been a hotspot for ghosts since the 1700s. Now, the Warrens weren't the first to come in and investigate this place for being packed with ghosts, but they did some pretty intense experiments to try and confirm their beliefs that ghosts were haunting the area. Ed went in there and spent 7 nights in the cemetery. That's like one of those questions where someone's like, what would you do for $1 million? Would you spend 7 nights in a cemetery? But this dude was doing it just for poops and giggles. I'm not going anywhere near that thing unless I'm getting at least 10K. But Ed did get exactly what he was looking for. During one of his nights in the cemetery, he saw a figure of a woman who was crying and walking towards him, but shadow figures came out and stopped her from reaching Ed. He snapped a picture that looked like a big white blob, but he claims that this was the White Lady using her electromagnetic energy to grab his attention. Next on the list, we have the Borley Church hauntings. The Warrens better be racking up a lot of money for all the movies that were made about their adventures. I hope that I live such a wild life that when I get old, people make movies about what I did. Now, if you have seen the movie The Nun, then you will know the backbone of this story. I don't think I need to state that the movies exaggerate what happened in real life, but this did take place at a church. There were reports of some creepy things happening. There was a headless ghost that would be seen walking around the church that people thought was a monk. There was the ghost of a dead nun that was seen walking around as well. Apparently, there was a body found of a nun in the walls of the church. It's thought that she could have been buried alive for having an affair with one of the monks. Damn, dude. They really didn't take stuff lightly back then. Next on the list, we have Bill Ramsey. Now, out of all the ones on this list, it would seem that this one would be probably the coolest. From the time Bill Ramsey was a kid, he had some pretty crazy things going on. He was insanely strong, and he would sometimes act like an animal. Maybe he was just a weird kid, and no one really cared because eventually he started acting normal. That's until he was a grown man. He started to crave blood and would wake up in the middle of the night panting like an animal. Eventually, he has to be locked up for the protection of the people around him when he started to attack people, and it took 6 cops to take him down. The Warrens came in and performed an exorcism, and after that, he was as right as rain. Next on this, guys, we have the Smurl family. It would seem that you couldn't move into a new home in the 70s or 80s without having something to do with ghosts inside of it already. Well, the Warrens were hot on the trail of this one after the Smurl family was attacked by several ghosts in their home. People were pushed down the stairs, the dog was thrown against the wall, items in the home were broken, and even things that were too graphic for this channel happened. The Warrens came in and pushed the ghosts out, and while doing so, they saw a dark being appear out of the floor and float up to the ceiling. Next on the list, guys, we have the Enfield poltergeist. Not every case with the Warrens turned into them being the masters of the spectral realm. Sometimes people wanted nothing to do with them. There was the case of the Enfield poltergeist, where there was apparently a kid who had a ghost living inside of him. Now, there were a bunch of reports saying that this kid was just making this up, but this didn't stop the Warrens from investigating. They heard word of a ghost and they wanted to get to the bottom of it. But when they showed up, they didn't even tell the family that they were coming. They thought they were famous enough to just be allowed to walk around any rumor of a ghost. I think the clout was getting to their head a little bit. But what ended up happening was the family didn't even let them into the house. The family talked to them for a little bit, but that's about as far as they got in terms of removing a ghost from a child. Next on the list, guys, we have the haunting in Connecticut. If I move into a new place, one of the first things I'm going to ask is if there has ever been a dead body in the house. It would seem that most ghost problems come from a slew of corpses hanging out in the basement at one time or another, and that's exactly what we have here. It was Carmen and Al Snydecker that needed to move into a new home so they could be closer to the hospital. See, their son was very sick and they wanted to be able to rush over at a moment's notice. Because of their desperation, they moved into a home that used to be a mortuary. So as you can imagine, there was a lot of ghost activity hanging around in the home. The family saw a ton of spectral activity. There was dead bodies that would rise out of the ground, blood would come out of the tap, spirits would walk down the hall. Now, there has been a ton of evidence to disprove a lot of the stuff the Warrens have said about the home, but I would like to add on the craziest thing that they said was causing the haunting. The Warrens claimed that the spirit spirits who haunt the home were angry because the people who used to work in the morgue would have sex with the dead bodies. Yeah, I didn't know ghosts cared that much about what happened to their bodies after they died. And also, how do you get those kind of details from a ghost? It's additions like that that make you question whether or not the Warrens were actually telling the truth. Alright guys, next we have the Annabelle doll. This has to be one of the most famous cases the Warrens have ever investigated thanks to the Annabelle movies. Now, the movies spruced her up a little bit, having her looking like an old Victorian doll, but she was actually a Raggedy Ann doll, which makes her much less menacing. But the stories surrounding this haunting figure are still pretty terrifying. The Annabelle doll was owned by a nurse back in the 70s who thought that it was just a cute little thing until it started to wake her up in the middle of the night with the sounds of crying and dreams of her being strangled by the doll. Yeah, at this point she should have burned it. But the girl got in contact with the Warrens and found out that the doll was possessed by a demonic spirit. So what was the best course of action? Burn the doll, maybe? Nope, instead put in a glass case on display in the Warrens Museum. Don't worry, they made sure that the case was blessed by holy water. And next on the list, guys, we have the Amityville Horror House. There has been movie after movie of this horror house, and even if you don't believe in ghosts, you have to admit that everything that went down in this house was pretty nuts. So the story starts with Ronald J. Defoe. This dude lived in the house with his family and then one day just snapped. He took a rifle and killed his whole family. That is insane and terrifying, but maybe the dude just went crazy and had nothing to do with ghosts. But then the Lutz family moved in and they said that a ton of horrific things happened while they were living in the house. They saw ghosts, they smelt rotting bodies, eyes would appear in rooms, their daughter would talk to an imaginary friend named Jody, and everyone in the family was constantly getting into fights. The family only lasted a month in the house before they fled because they were worried about ripping the family apart. After all this, the Warrens came in and they said that there was a demonic being in the house, and Lorraine saw bodies laid out on the floor through her psychic powers. And then they found out that back in the 1900s, someone used the house to practice black magic.
Number 10. We're starting off strong with the Devil Made Me Do It case. If you're a fan of Ed and Lorraine, you know this one. The Devil Made Me Do It case is arguably one of the most famous cases that Ed and Lorraine ever worked on. But beyond the supernatural, this case was right in the public eye. Not only were there demons and the supernatural, but the scrutiny of the public eye made this a whole different monster for the Warrens. A bunch of people outside of the courthouse making claims and threats over the case isn't easy to deal with. When 19-year-old Arne Johnson took the life of his landlord and blamed it on the devil, Ed and Lorraine jumped to his defense. They were convinced a demon had entered him after he tried to save his brother from a vicious possession a year earlier. His younger brother was possessed by 43 demons, and Arne commanded that they leave him and enter him instead. The Warrens fell under immense scrutiny, but according to them, the court had defended accounts of God in the past. Now it was time to defend accounts of the devil. But one thing remains strange to me. Arne was never exorcised after the event. Does that mean they're still with him?
Coming into number 9, we have the White Lady of Union Cemetery. Ed and Lorraine have investigated many cases and usually have been the duo behind the case's fame. The White Lady of Union Cemetery long since outdates and surpasses the Warrens. Nonetheless, the pair did have a scary moment there and even caught a ghost on camera. The cemetery is in eastern Connecticut and the site dates back to the 1700s. The graveyard is said to be haunted by a plethora of ghosts, the White Lady being just one of them. Ed stayed in the graveyard for 7 nights and saw ghost lights filling up the place. He said on September 1st, 1990, he experienced something particularly scary. He said he heard a woman weeping. He said shadow ghosts tried to stop the woman getting to him, and this was the photo he took. This is what he had to say.
Your stereotype ghost right here.
Isn't that beautiful?
The electromagnetic energy taken from the plant life in the cemetery is used by the spirit to form this image.
Coming into number 8, we have the devil. Ed and Lorraine Warren met the devil and they testified to it. This all went down in 1981 when they were called into a murder trial. Arne Johnson claimed to have killed his landlord because the devil made him do it. It all started with a possessed 11-year-old David Glatzel. This is where Ed and Lorraine first stepped into the picture. The pair were called in to try and rid the boy of the demon along with Catholic priests. Over several days, the group did eventually get rid of the demon. However, according to them, the demon fled into his brother 18-year-old Arnie's body. Oof. A few months later, he killed his landlord in an argument. His defense lawyer argued that he was possessed. Now here is a clip of Ed talking about Arnie.
And he screamed at these devils. Take me on. Leave my little buddy alone. He got his wish.
He challenged the demonic.
He challenged the demonic.
Then he says this about when he became possessed.
And Arne disappeared for a few minutes. When he came back, he was somebody entirely different.
Ed and Lorraine spoke at his trial and attested to the fact that he was indeed possessed by the devil. Thus ensued a media blitz around the case. The pair then wrote a book called The Devil in Connecticut following the incident. Arne Johnson served just 5 years in jail. Coming into number 7, we have the Borley Rectory. According to demonologists, ghost hunters and psychics like Ed and Lorraine, the Borley Rectory is the most haunted place in the United Kingdom. The building was constructed in Victorian times in Essex, and rumours of its hauntings were rife from the very beginning. Ghost hunters claimed the activity is related to a Benedictine monastery built in the area in 1362. A monk was said to have been executed, and a nun bricked alive in the walls of a convent after the pair had an affair. Obviously, good old Ed and Lorraine had to go for a jaunt to check it out. When talking about their first experience at the property, Lorraine said that she was with a skeptical newspaper reporter. She shares an experience of what happened to him.
Something is hitting me. It's hitting me. It's hitting me. And he was absolutely hysterical.
Ugh, a hitting ghost, not what you need. Then she continued by saying,
He said, I can't breathe. I can't breathe.
Later, Lorraine said that a recording taken at the church at this moment revealed a woman's voice saying,
Hit him. Hit him. Almost in a healing way, and you hear her very gentle voice.
Chilling. Was the monk hitting him because the nun wanted him to? Coming into number 6, we have The Witch of Harrisville. Some of you guys may have seen The Conjuring. Well, that horrifying movie is based on a house that the Warrens investigated in Rhode Island. Now, this house was haunted by a witch called Bathsheba Sherman. She is said to have cursed the land so that whoever lived on it in the future would die. What a babe. One of the Perron family members, Andrea, discusses her time in the house. In this clip, she's talking about her sister.
And the door opened to the pantry, and April looked up at my mother and she said, Mommy, something really bad happened in there. Indeed. It's where little Prudence Arnold had her throat cut.
Ed and Lorraine visited the home and exorcised the witch. Or did they? When members from the Ed and Lorraine Warren Museum visited Bathsheba's grave, this is what they heard.
Don't be scared.
Kill. Who are you gonna kill?
Coming into number 5, we have the Enfield poltergeist. The Enfield poltergeist was a case investigated by Ed and Lorraine in 1977. The pair travelled to England to investigate the rumoured haunted home in North London. They deduced the mysterious goings-on were a result of demonic possession. The residents recorded sounds that took place in a bedroom after their children had gone to bed. Now, bear in mind, in the 70s, not a lot of people had video recording equipment or even audio recording equipment.
The lights gone out. Oh. Wait. Squeeze the light out.
Throw the lamp
on the head.
right way across the room and pull it out of the socket.
So we hear screaming and confusion as the lights go out. It seems as if a lamp was pulled out of the socket. Then this happens.
Who's that shaking the door? What's on there? Mum's laughing.
It seems a slipper was used as a projectile by some kind of ghoul and thrown across the room. Over a period of 18 months, more than 30 people, including neighbours, fellow psychic researchers and journalists, said that they saw furniture moving of its own accord and objects being thrown across the room. It was even said that one of the children in the house levitated. Spooky. The events that took place in this Enfield house make up the inspiration behind The Conjuring 2. Coming into number 4, very famous, we have Amityville. In a 2013 interview, Lorraine Warren said that this case haunted her the most. She said, I will never go in the Amityville house again. What happened in this house that made a self-confessed expert demonologist scared to return? The story goes that in 1974, 23-year-old Ronald J. Defoe Jr. murdered his entire entire family when they slept at their home in Amityville. He killed 6 people. Now these were said to be his 4 siblings and his parents. He said he heard voices that told him to do it. After a year, the house was eventually purchased for just $80,000, although the buyers, the Lutz family, stayed just 28 days because of the horror they experienced. George and Kathy Lutz said that they saw slime coming out of the walls, knives being thrown from counters, figures wandering and wailing. George even said that he saw his wife levitating and an evil red-eyed pig-like creature glaring at him. Ed and Lorraine were brought in along with a priest to rid the house of spirits. In an interview, Ed said,
When we went into the house that day, we didn't realize that it was diabolically infested. And on a scale of 1 to 10, I would have to say that Amityville was a 10.
Oh my god. The pair believed that it was the house that cursed the murderer rather than the murderer that cursed the house. Today, there have been 18 different films about the home. Okay, because Amityville was so scary it gets 2 points of its very own. We have The Ghost Boy at number 3. This picture was taken by Ed Warren as he investigated the Amityville house. The picture shows what appears to be a demonic boy. The Warrens suspected it could be one of the youngest children with his eyes glowing from the infrared film. The Warrens believe that this is one of the most credible pieces of evidence for ghosts ever caught on camera. Honestly, it gives me chills to look at this picture. Coming into number 2, we have the very famous Annabelle doll. So many of you will know the horrifying story of Annabelle, a possessed real doll behind the Annabelle and Conjuring franchise. Ed and Lorraine were called upon by 2 young women to deal with an out-of-control Raggedy Ann doll. The doll then became infamous for being demonically possessed, perpetuating the trope for the demon dolly. Annabelle lives in a locked case in the Warrens Occult Museum. Now there isn't any video evidence of the doll being a menace, but things did get pretty scary recently when the doll was moved in a Facebook Live video. On hand at the Warrens Museum were Dan Rivera and Tony Sepra, who were handling the move. Dan says this about Annabelle.
The most diabolical, most haunted, most evil item in the Occult Museum.
And he is also charged with moving the doll. Tony explains how Dan has made it safe to move Annabelle here.
As long as your skin is not going to be in contact with the aura of that doll, which is touching the surface of the doll with your human hands. You don't want to do that.
Before the doll is moved, the pair pray.
Saint Michael the Archangel, defend us in battle, be our protection against the malice and snares of the devil. May God rebuke him, we humbly pray. And do thou, O Prince of the heavenly host, by the power of God, thrust into hell Satan and all the evil spirits who wander through the world for the ruin of souls. Amen.
Okay, watch as they move the doll now, it's really tense.
Okay, quickly. Right over here. Go into the new case.
They then pray again and also tell a story about a guy who provoked Annabelle by tapping on her case. According to the duo, the man died that evening in a bike accident. Okay, finally, arguably one of the most haunted places in the world, a truly terrifying place. I'm not sure I'd even ever set foot in it. We have the Occult Museum. So this is one of the scariest things that Ed and Lorraine ever experienced together. This was the creation of their Occult Museum in Monroe, Connecticut. This is what Lorraine said about the place when she was leading a tour of her home.
You're in probably one of the most haunted places in the world because of the things that are in here. Everything in here has been taken from some place where people are either killed or maimed or so many ways. So it's tragic for me.
So basically it's the culmination of all of their scary cases in one. In the museum you can find Annabelle, no thanks, and the Conjuring mirror, and way more. She says you should never ever touch anything in the museum. Now despite living with Annabelle in the museum, this is Lorraine's reaction when she walks by her.
This is the worst thing in here, is that doll. I'm not gonna stare at it though. So you can take the picture, but I'm not going to stare at it because that has done bad harm on a lot of people.
A priest circulates the museum daily to bless the space.
Father, of the Son, of the Holy spirit, amen?
What has been done is circular embolism, which is prayers, are said all the time, you know, to pray.
Yeah.